Welcome back, Curious Hearts. I'm Vera. Together, in every episode, we get to explore what it is we really believe, how we practice, and we get to meet people who are on their own spiritual path. Together, we begin. Hey, y'all. Welcome back. Today, we're exploring perhaps one of the most, if not the most important spiritual principle, in my opinion. And it's so important that it's in the subtitle of the podcast, which is about making meaning. Our curious hearts, right? This thing that we all share, the thing that brought us together to listen today, those hearts are asking questions. And I think that those are a human birthright. It's something that we all do naturally. I don't think we need to be taught how to do it. It's innate. And that innate curiosity inside of us asks questions like, why am I here? What is my purpose? Why was I born at this moment into this family, into this life, into this country? What am I supposed to be doing here? And that inherent search for meaning, search for both a personal purpose and also our collective purpose, is one of the greatest privileges of having a spiritual life, as far as I can tell. So, why is it that we're doing that, and why are we talking about it today? Well, we're talking about it because I think this is the most important power that we have in our lives. Our strategy, our approach to making meaning with our life is what brings us together. It's what brings us to spiritual practice and spiritual life. And it is the thing that keeps renewing itself, right? We don't answer that question once and then, move forward for the rest of our lives. Inherently, things in our life change, whether our personal circumstances or the world around us. And we find ourselves back at that same question of, why am I here? The inability to answer that question, or the fear that there is no answer to that question of why am I here? What's my purpose? That is the seed, that is the core of what we know as existential dread. Existential dread says there's no point to any of this. It says it's not even worth trying. It's not even worth finding. Or even if I could find my purpose, does it even matter? Can I make an impact? Can I make a change? Existential dread is that little gremlin that crawls into our ear and says, no, you can't make any impact. You can't make any change. And that fear of our lives being meaningless, being purposeless, is devastating. That fear is demotivating. It has the potential to unravel us, both in our practical material lives, but also in our emotional lives and in our spiritual lives. So if you're in one of those moments of existential dread, you're not alone. I think everybody who's listening right now has had one of those moments where they deeply fear that what they're doing, who they are, their whole life doesn't matter. It feels important for me to say that every time I dive deep into one of these subjects to prepare and to develop what I want to share with you, I find myself going to ground zero. I have been wrestling with this great question, and I don't think that that question has a permanent answer. But I know that as a community and as a person, just as a being living in the world, I am having to reevaluate and redevelop the answer to this question of what am I even doing here? And I think that the answer to that question is often, encapsulated with the word our life's purpose, or our life's work, even if that's not our paid work. It is the thing that we feel in our bones is what we are here for. It's the thing that we feel like we can uniquely do. And that purpose is motivating. It gives us inspiration. It gives us the drive to move forward, even when things collapse in front of us, even when we're faced with failure, even when the people around us maybe doubt us or are in their own existential spiral, and so they can't possibly see the way forward. So, this drive back to our purpose is so iconic. It's so innate to being human. And what's interesting about meaning making or purpose finding is that I think it is what has, not only do I think it is innate, I know that as humans, we tell stories, right? And so the way that we build our own story, the way that we draft our own narrative, is how we are relating to the world. It's one of the ways that we understand the sort of chaos of the world around us. There's also an interesting background to this that I want to share just a little bit about. And it's from a book called Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. The subtitle of this book, Sapiens, is called A Brief History of Humankind. And it's sort of an intellectual evolutionary history of the human race from, the moment we were Homo sapiens and then our development into our modern culture. There's so much to say about this book, but in the very beginning, the thesis, one of the points he makes, is that it wasn't until we started to share stories that we could really connect as humans or build societies or collectives. So in the very beginning, hunter-gatherer stages, there is a natural distrust of someone or something that we don't know. If we've never engaged with a certain person, we don't know if they're reliable. We don't know if they'll show up. We don't know if we can trade with them in a way that is reliable or that they are trustworthy. You can imagine that if we take ourselves all the way back to before podcasts and computers and cars and newspapers, before we could get information by Googling somebody, if we were just moving about in the world, we probably had the experience of someone stealing, being unkind, or even violent. We probably lived with a daily reality of that low-level distrust, unless we had direct experience with somebody, right? Unless we knew them, they were in our tribe or lived with us. And those relationships probably had some nuance. Or if somebody that we knew said that you can trust this person. I have had an experience with this person. They are trustworthy. But that means that our circles were pretty small, right? It meant that we were in small collectives, small villages of people. Maybe we were wandering together. We learned that those people that we traveled with were safe. The people that we were living and eating and hunting with were safe. And that anybody outside of that was potentially dangerous. That's perfectly fine until humanity begins to expand. And so suddenly we have civilizations, towns, places that are more than 200 people. Suddenly when there are cities of 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 people, it's actually impossible to have that kind of sense of trust, to know enough about someone to know that they're safe and that we can interact with them. So over time, what humans did in their own miraculous way is they created shared stories. And Harari presents this as a shared invention of reality, right? Most of those stories are imaginary, actually. And when I'm talking about stories here, I'm talking about things like citizenship or nationhood or religious or cultural beliefs. I live in the United States. The idea of the United States of America is a shared common story that we all tell and we all reinforce. And those stories that we tell are based on our history and all sorts of cultural things that go with that. But you can't put your hand on the United States of America. You can point to a map, but the squiggly lines and the place names We're all made up. These are shared stories that as a collective we agree on. And so as a result of that, when I'm living in a population of 20,000 people, and I can't know all 19,999 other people who live there. But if I meet you in Bangkok and you tell me you're a New Orleanian, I immediately know something about you. I have a shared story with you. I have a shared history with you. And there are cultural norms. There's a whole series of things that develop as a result of that shared story of New Orleans, or that shared story of the United States, or that shared story of Christianity, that shared story of Buddhism. We develop these identities that are made up. They're imaginary, every single one of them. They are not innate. They are not concrete. And it's through those ideas and stories that we have been able to evolve as humanity. Now, you can argue with me about whether that's been a good thing or not, and that's not what we're doing right now. What is important is for you to begin to understand that there actually are all of these stories that each of us has both inherited and created. And those stories help us understand how we answer the question of our purpose. We also know from things like modern marketing, sociology, and anthropology that stories are how people have taught each other, how we have transmitted information for, since before recorded history. Just a simple like beginning, middle, end. There is the establishment of the basic narrative. There is some dramatic arc that happens and then a final resolution. Those stories are stories that we have told and shared and that our brains are hardwired to understand. All you need to do is have read a little bit of Brene Brown to know that this is true, or things like, the story map, or the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell and the hero of 1,000 faces. All of these are ways that we understand the world. It's how we communicate with each other about our lives and our place. So we've talked a little bit about meaning making, purpose finding, and a little bit about story and how we build stories and narratives. So now I want you to think about a story that you have heard. Maybe it's very personal to you. Maybe a story in your family. Maybe one of your parents or the people who you grew up with told you something about where you're from. I'll give you an example. My father told us the story, and when I say us, I mean my brothers and I. We descended from a man who was Welsh, and that man's last name was Ellister, spelled like Leicester Square in England, with a whole lot of extra letters, and he was a ribbon weaver. At some point through the course of the world, he realized that nobody could spell Ellister, and when they read it, they said Leicester. And just for business, it didn't work. So he changed it. He shortened it to Lester, which is my last name now. That's part of my origin story. It also tells me something about myself. And it told my father something about himself, about being this Welshman with this dark hair and these blue eyes of a Welshman. And, being sort of stout and round like a Welshman, and being hardy like a Welshman. And that's something I inherited too, having this dark hair and these blue eyes and that hardy stoutness of Welshness. Except my great-grandfather was not Welsh. Through the course of some extraordinary events, I discovered that my grandfather was born by the name of Hugo Bohl, Bohl. And his parents were both German immigrants to New York in the late 19th century. My grandfather, Hugo Bohl, had been an actor. He worked in vaudeville and changed his name because he was trying to be a professional actor across the United States in 1915. So there he was at the beginning of World War I when Germans were the enemy. And here he was with this very German name. And so he changed it from Hugo Bull to Hugh Lester. And then he named his son, my father, Hugh Lester. And now we have been Lesters ever since. So my name is only 2 generations old. Such a simple change from the Welshman weaving ribbons to the actor in vaudeville who was German. So much of the scope of the narrative of my family. Suddenly we were not sturdy, stout Welshmen. We were German. And did that change the way we thought about ourselves or our own histories? Maybe you have your own example of your story. And this is one of the reasons that I think family lineage and ancestral practice can add layers of meaning and purpose to our lives. The next piece of this is that our brains are hardwired to tell stories. So when I believed that my great-great-grandfather was Alistair, I went looking and I kept finding people and evidence of that Alistair past and of the Welsh past. And I could find things that maybe pointed in that direction that would support that story. And this is how our brains work. When we have an assumed story, when we have this internal narrative about exactly the way things are or what's happening, we start to identify the evidence in the world around us. And that evidence we fit to meet the story that we already have. Conversely, if we come up with evidence, our brains will unconsciously filter out the things that don't fit into the narrative that we are assuming to be true. I don't think there's anything wrong with this inherently. I think this is part of the way that our brain structures have evolved over time. Probably creates a lot of shortcuts that we've benefited from. But I think it's an important notion for each of us to be really profoundly aware of. In the course of our spiritual practice, the stories that we're telling, the meaning that we were handed, we were delivered by our families, by our childhoods, by our cultures, those stories are things that we start to become aware of. We stop taking for granted or assuming those stories to be true. And we get a little bit of space, right? We talked about making space a couple of episodes ago. And this is one of the things that making space allows us to do. It allows us to get enough space that we have perspective to see the stories that we are telling or are assuming. So when we think about meaning making and purpose, that also starts to influence our identities, right? And one of the great privileges of being on a spiritual path and having a spiritual practice is that spiritual practice allows us to pull out the threads of meaning that we've been working with. So, for an example, there are influences that we get based on how we grew up, right? I'm the youngest child in my family. And so being a youngest child takes on a certain, mind of its own. My experience of the world was determined by, having an older brother and the fact that my parents were still married when I was a kid. Those stories shaped the way that I saw the world. So I was the youngest. That meant I was coming into spaces where people already knew my family and they already knew my older brother. And so maybe they already had assumptions about me. Right? He had a different experience in a lot of places, right? He might have started, and if you were an oldest child, you were a trailblazer wherever you went. You were the first of your name that stood forth into these communities, and people got to know you, and maybe you felt some pressure about that. As we grow older, then when we move in the world, right, that oldest child might feel the pressure of being the first. and carry a weight of setting expectations for people or making sure that people really understand them so that they can be clear because they don't know anything about them at all. And so they have this constant feeling of having to demonstrate and explain with there being no history. Whereas somebody like me, if there's a second child or the youngest child following behind even a longer train of siblings, right? If I'm the youngest, that I enter into these relationships into the world, thinking that people consciously or unconsciously already know about me. They're already making assumptions about me and comparing me with other members of my family and my siblings. And so now I'm trying to prove myself. I'm either trying to live up to the reputation that was set by, the other members of my family, or I'm trying to prove that I'm not like them. I'm understanding that I'm operating in this space of being compared to and evaluated against the people in my family. So I bring that subtle energy into all the other relationships that I'm in, even after I move out of my family of origin. These are a mundane example, right? That's like a simple example that hopefully everybody understands. There's probably a whole different narrative of story that comes with being an only child, right? Or having step siblings, or being adopted into or out of your family, having parents that are married versus separated, right? There are all sorts of stories that we just inherit based on our family circumstance. And we might have different relationships with those stories now as adults, but there's nothing inherently good or bad about those stories as far as I'm concerned. Same thing, right? This is just like that story of our relationships and where we fit starts to project itself into our other relationships, consciously or unconsciously. You might also see, even with the simple example of family, that there are other stories like that. Stories that develop and worldviews, right? And our worldview is based on how we fit in that wider invented structure of, culture, city, state, nation, religion, cultural identity, racial group, ethnicity, all of those things. Being an American, for example, being born in the United States of America gives me a certain story about what it means to be American, what my responsibilities are, what my freedoms are as an American, all of those stories, right? And Sam and I talked in the last episode, and if you haven't listened to it, gosh, I hope you'll go back and listen because I really loved having that conversation and then listening back to it. This idea of patriotism as a kind of religion could be explored for a long time. I'm sure smarter people than us have explored those things. But this belief system is something that all of us inherit. Whether we are born into a religion or a religious practice or a spiritual practice or not, we all come into the world with the frameworks of our cultural belief systems. One of the other ways that those belief systems impact us is what our responsibility to the collective, our community, our fellow citizens, our family. This is influenced by the country we're born into and also, religious traditions and generally, and this is a broad brush, Westerners, especially Americans, have this internalized belief and assumption, their story, that their primary responsibility is to themselves. That I'm here to get mine. I am self-determined. I am independent. I don't need other people, or that it is somehow virtuous to be able to build a life by yourself. That needing help, getting support, whether that's emotional support or financial support or physical support from other people, is somehow inherently weak, that there is like a feeling of failure, right? So that you can see all of the judgments that are coming with that, all of the layers of good and bad and virtue and unvirtue and responsibility, all of the color that comes with those ideas. You might inherently, instinctively have a reaction to that story about independence and individuality. And it might be a positive reaction, it might be negative, it might be mixed. Mine is for sure very mixed. But that story about being an individual and being self-determined is very much an inheritance, the story inheritance of my culture, where I was born and when I grew up. Whereas in other cultures, in other countries, and it's, again, broad brush, tends to be more Eastern and Asian cultures. This, to a certain degree, is very true in India and in the Indian diaspora. My understanding is that it's quite true in places like China and Japan and Eastern Asia. That our responsibility is first to the collective, that each of us are responsible to each other. If I have to make a decision between what's best for us and what's best for me, I should decide, the virtuous thing to do is to decide what is best for the collective. So in practice, what that looks like is things like a responsibility to our parents and to our family. It looks like not moving far from your parents or where you grew up because you have a responsibility or even an obligation to care for your family unit. Also, it's around things like public health matters, right? And I think we ran into a lot of conflict between these two inherent warring stories culturally across the globe. That in the United States, for example, public health guidance said, if you wear a mask, you lower your risk of getting sick. That was an intentional message based on a broad American consciousness, right? Certainly did not land evenly with everybody, but that's broad American consciousness says, I take care of me first. Whereas even before the COVID pandemic, you would see images or pictures or understand that in places like Japan, if someone was sick, they wore a mask. They did not wear that mask to protect themselves. They wore that mask because they were responsible to their community. And that community responsibility included protecting the community from whatever illness they might have. It's easy, I think, for us to look at one of those as being better or worse than the other. And the reality is they both have strengths and challenges. So for now, I want us to just set aside our own personal value judgments and recognize these are two different stories. These are two ways of making meaning about how we fit in our wider community. So, God, why am I talking about stories and personal responsibility and responsibility to the collective on a spiritual podcast? Well, because I think that it's one of the most important things for us to evaluate in a spiritual podcast. And if our meaning making is one of the greatest powers we have, one of our greatest responsibilities as humans, then we have to start with our inherited stories. What are the things that we learned from being born in the country we were born in? What are the things that we learned from growing up in the family that we grew up in, growing up in the place that we grew up in? What we learned from not just what we were taught in a classroom, but how the cultures of our education and our schools were developed. What have we learned about whether God exists or doesn't exist? Whether God cares about us or doesn't care about us? What have we learned about whether God has direction over our choices and our lives, or whether we get to choose how our fate unfolds? These are big questions for big, hungry, curious hearts. And those questions are the aching, pulsing questions that are living in us all the time. And until we start to have a relationship with those questions and that curiosity, I think our lives have a sense of flatness. Tastes like your foot's asleep. It's one of the ways that my grandmother puts this in a poem. There is a, a lack of depth. There's a lack of meaning to life until we start to wrangle with some of these questions. Now, here's the hard part. Most of these questions don't have a correct answer. That to me is the dividing line between spiritual life, spiritual practice, and religious tenets. You can have a deep and rich spiritual experience and spiritual practice regardless of your religious tradition. And you might practice religious traditions. You might be a practicing Buddhist, right? Or a practicing Hindu, or you might be a devout Catholic or a lapsed Episcopalian. I think those are important frameworks. And also, inside of those frameworks, individually, personally, often privately, we start to have these same questions about, do I actually choose my life? Or is everything fated? Does it matter whether I take this particular job or not? How do I know what the right things are to do in my life? How do I make these choices? Those are big, weighty, important questions. And certainly we can evaluate them intellectually. Certainly we can relate to them emotionally. But until we add the depth of spiritual inquiry and spiritual practice, I think we're missing a whole part of ourselves that is really, really essential. So, how does our spiritual practice influence our meaning making? Part of that I can't answer for you because it is something that you will experience directly as a result of your practice, whether that practice is walking in nature. When I walk out into nature, there is a vast expanse of extraordinary beauty. Life is self-perpetuating, and it continues and has tiny examples of miracles here available for me all the time. There is a sense of awe in it. Walking in nature creates that story, and that story is reinforced by the spiritual practice of being in nature. Meditation, depending on the practice, right, maybe a practice of being completely still and quieting our mind reinforces the meaning that our being is eternal. There is no beginning and no end to this consciousness. Certainly the body changes, but my body is not what's happening when I'm in quiet, silent meditation. It is my consciousness that exists. And maybe, sometimes I get a direct experience that consciousness has always been and it will always be. And while it observes and has a relationship with the universe, it is eternal and complete. That eternal completeness then changes how I show up in the world, doesn't it? Yes, I understand it, but my body will change, but my beingness will continue no matter what happens. That is part of the meaning that I am making and living and experiencing through my practice. So those are just a couple of examples of the way that our spiritual practices can both shape the meaning that we're making and inform the stories that we already have, our sort of inherent nature of being in the world. You can imagine, too, we talked a little bit about individuality versus collectivism, that as an individual, I might be more called. I need to go on a personal spiritual journey. I need to go on a pilgrimage. I'm a yoga teacher in the United States. I need to go to India and go to sacred places and be taken out of my everyday reality so that I can personally, uniquely experience, right? That's the individual nature. If my experience were more collective, I would never want to leave my spiritual community. I would want to be in connection. And so my spiritual practice might look something like metta meditation from the Buddhist practice, or Tonglen, which is a compassion practice, where those practices are reinforcing the interconnected nature between myself and other selves, and over time might dissolve away any confusion that I have that there is, in fact, only one of us, and that the illusion is that we're separate, right? That if I have this infinite, expansious consciousness, that I long for happiness and freedom, and I understand that all other beings also long for happiness, joy, and freedom, that actually we're the same, and there is nothing that separates us, right? That's, boy, that's a whole bunch of philosophical systems in a tiny nutshell. The meaning is our agency. It is our power. And in the moments of great doubt, which will come for us, the moments of great doubt that come, we are brought back to the foundational questions again of our curious heart that says, wait, am I sure? Is this right for me? Is this why I'm here? And now I will make perhaps a radical statement, which is what some of my teachers have said, which is that your life has no inherent meaning or purpose. That does not mean that your life is meaningless or purposeless, but it has no inherent meaning or purpose. And so what we are doing when we move in our spiritual lives, when we inquire with these deep questions, when we engage in practices that make us more expansive and more open and more present, is we are engaging with our own created meaning. And in that creation, in that discovery of the meaning that resonates with us, we are also staking our claim. We are affirming the value and the necessity of that existence. This is a hard one. This is a really, really tough one. And if me even suggesting it is spinning you out, you have full permission to just put that down. But I have found that over the course of my spiritual experience, my spiritual discovery, the answer to what that meaning and that purpose is changes. And the things that I were certain about a decade ago, I now know for sure are not true. And if my connection to my own meaning, my own life's purpose, is that fragile, if I get attached to, I'm supposed to be a performer, right? When I was in my teens, right? I am destined to be an actress. That didn't happen. That was absolutely my purpose and my meaning that I pursued then. And over time, I let it go. And the process of letting it go was a spiritual process. That has continued to evolve over time, and probably for you too. There may have been a point in your life where you were sure that your purpose was to get this very specific job, to make a really extraordinary scientific discovery. Maybe your purpose was to build an empire of real estate and continue to develop your family name. Maybe your purpose was to have a family and to be the patriarch or the matriarch of a great expansive network of children and cousins and aunties and uncles. And perhaps that purpose has lived out for you, and perhaps life has changed. But either way, our spiritual practice is what walks alongside us. It is the routine and the ritual that feeds our connection to that meaning and that purpose. So, the last place that I will leave you is with a promise, I think. And that promise is that there will be moments when you see with crystal clarity the meaning in your own life. And you will feel grounded and anchored into it, as certain as you are about gravity and the floor beneath you. And you will feel your own purpose in every breath, and you will feel it pulse through your veins, and it will power you like steam, like a coal fire. It will drive you. It will come up behind you and push you forward like the wind or like waves. And then there will be parts of your life, there will be moments in your life where the winds and the waves die down and that momentum begins to fade and wane. And you may find yourself stagnant. You may find yourself mired in quicksand of not being able to catch on to any of the other ropes, any of the other things that you were supposed to be doing, that you knew for certain. And those moments, as uncomfortable as they are, as painful as they can be, those moments are the gateways. Those moments are the doorways into meeting ourselves and to meeting each other. So just like every other part of our spiritual life, there is a paradox too in the meaning making. Being in a place where we feel stuck, or we feel lost, or we feel at sea, that feeling of being unmoored might feel very scary, depressing, anxiety producing, or confusing. It is for those moments that we have built a practice. So if you are there in one of those moments, I am just reaching out through the airwaves and holding your curious heart in mine. But if you've lived long enough, you know that those moments exist. And those moments are the reason why we cultivate this connection the rest of the time. Because then we have some pathway, we have some method, some inkling of an idea that might carry us out. And fortunately or unfortunately for me, those moments of being unmoored, of feeling completely lost, have been the portals into my next level of spiritual and personal and human growth. My ability to expand beyond the limitations that I had before. And that is really the beauty, I think, of this meaning finding practice and meaning making. We learn to hold it like a loose garment, to wear it like a loose garment. We use it as a wayfinder. And in the moments when it needs to be adapted or upgraded, over time, through our spiritual practices, we learn to let go of that grip of what it needed to be, what we were supposed to be. And we're able to step out into a wider ocean. Storytelling and like developing these narratives is a very human need. And spirit does not need those stories. Spirit is expansive and eternal and is both and neither at the same time. Finding practices that allow us to be in that tremendous paradox, in that confusion, in that state of no, neither, and yes, both. Those are the practices that will bring us back to this wider, expansive spiritual sense of ourself. If you are finding that your sense of meaning has expired, it's okay for you to go back and reconnect with that tiny, questioning, curious part of your own heart to help answer this next round of meaning making. If you are feeling disconnected from a sense of meaning, you can choose. You can make a choice to follow a path of a certain meaning or purpose until it no longer serves you. Meaning is not about explaining or understanding everything in that way that we need to know. We need to contain it. If we can define it and measure it, then we can control it. Meaning instead is this relationship that we cultivate with the mystery of who we are, why we're here, and what now. And that mystery calls out to our curious hearts, carries us forward. And perhaps most importantly, that mystery and that curiosity draws us to each other to have these conversations. Today, my prayer for you, my blessing, is that you will have a bone deep knowledge of purpose, that you will feel the truth of the meaning of your existence, and also be able to hold that meaning loosely enough that it will change as you continue to change and grow. Thanks for tuning in, Curious Hearts. If this episode was useful, I hope you'll follow the show or leave a review or share it with somebody who you think needs it. And if you're craving support on your own spiritual path or seeking some meaningful work, you can find ways to work with me at veralester.com. Otherwise, until next time, please stay grounded in that curiosity and keep turning towards what matters. See y'all soon.